So I am Don Haas, the Director of Teacher Programs at the Paleontological Research Institution in Ithaca, New York. Up until 2 weeks ago, I referred to myself as PRI's only telecommuter. Now we're virtually all telecommuting. This is the kickoff event for Science in the Virtual Pub. We are trying it out. It's a transition from Science in the Actual Pub that we were doing in Buffalo. Ken Zidell, who's on the call, started that up in January with meetings on the last Wednesday of the month. We have not yet figured out the schedule for what we're going to do with Science in the Virtual Pub, but we're starting tonight. And we're starting with taking advantage of the educational moment to talk about reinventing the educational system in a time of disruption. So let's get to it. I'm sorry, I'm gonna get you out of the way. And here we go, I think, there we go. So again, grab a drink, settle in, keep your microphones muted. I am planning to talk about 30 minutes and then open it up for discussion as long as people want to discuss. And the basic plan is that I will make the case for why reform is so desperately needed and has been so difficult, share relevant insights from innovation in other sectors of society, build understandings of the educational system as a complex system by comparing it to an ecosystem, and pay special attention to disturbance ecology, because we've got a disturbance in the educational ecosystem, the likes of which we have not seen in our lifetimes. And of course, set us to the task of changing the world. A small piece of cake there. And some things worth noting from the outset: that the most valuable things in our educational system are the human resources, especially the wisdom and passion of our teaching force. The current moment has the potential to be a great unshackling of this wisdom and passion. And you will see that I am highly critical of the longstanding system, but that is very different from being critical of the educators within it. Now I'm gonna, I don't think I'm gonna ask you to actually shout these out, but to think these out. It is a pretty big crowd, so I wanna keep the sounds manageable. But I want you to name an innovation from the last 40 years that has made substantial improvements in user outcomes for a bunch of different systems. And by substantial improvements in user outcomes, I mean that people who are engaged in using these things wouldn't want to go back to not having these innovations in form to be useful in using within the system. So think about innovations in the last 40 years. That's taken us back to 1980 in communications. So think about what innovations are out there in communication. And again, I'm not actually going to have you shout them out. Entertainment, retail, finance, the energy system, and the transportation system. And I'll pause and throw out some fairly obvious answers on those. In the communications systems, of course, back in 1980, we didn't have much of an internet at all. Maybe DARPA had started some computers talking with one another a little bit by then, but certainly the internet and the way we use computers and the existence of smartphones has changed that system tremendously, and the entertainment system as well, and retail as well. Of course, Amazon is immediately comes to mind for that for me. For finance, I think the first ATM was introduced in the mid to late 70s, and they were not very common up until during the 1980s. His heart was set on the Indian maid with the coal black hair. Elijah. Shut up my phone from making noises and making noise. Excuse me for that. And the energy system, we are now in New York State getting 0% of our electricity from coal. That certainly was not the case in 1980, and the list of things on that changes in the energy system is very long indeed. Fracking is another example of an important innovation. Whether you like it or not, it's changed the system substantially. In the transportation system, we've got Uber and Lyft and hybrid and electric cars like we've never seen before. And then there's the education system to think about. And I'm going to put that here. When we try and think of a way that people are generally smarter than they were 40 years ago because of some change in the educational system, that is very, very, very hard to come up with examples. And I'll say, you may weep now, but really just kidding about that. And why haven't we seen any substantial improvements in the education system in decades? We have actually learned a fair amount more about effective learning and teaching, but little of what we've learned has been translated into practice in a way that has demonstrably been traced to improved outcomes of schooling. And I am not talking about standardized tests. I am talking about people being able to reason through problems more effectively, to be able to apply knowledge to the responsibilities of citizenship. And I just don't think those improvements are essentially detectable. There are a bunch of reasons why for that. Reforming schools share a lot of obstacles with responding to climate change. That includes different cognitive biases and logical fallacies. And if you want to dig deeper, there's a point or two within this presentation where there's a digging deeper link where you can follow up on more about that. And I'll probably add a few more in the coming days and weeks to this presentation. And the link to this presentation I added to the announcement document right before the session started. Second reason why innovation has been so difficult is that we don't learn from innovations in other areas terribly effectively. When we do that, we see that successful innovations are what Berger called optically distinct, or optimally distinct rather, in an article in the Harvard Business Review. And optimally distinct means that they're different enough to make a difference, but not so different that you don't understand them. So innovations fail if they are too different from current practice to be understood, or if they're not different enough to make a real difference. And they tend to combine the conventional with the conventional in unconventional ways. So in other words, putting two well-understood ideas together that haven't been put together before and doing something with those ideas is a very likely way to improve, to yield an innovation. A very interesting article from the journal Science from 2013 about that, called Atypical Combinations in Scientific Impact, notes that the highest impact science is primarily grounded in exceptionally conventional combinations of prior work, yet simultaneously features an intrusion of unusual combinations. And papers of that type were twice as likely to be highly cited works as in comparison to other published studies. And I strongly recommend that any scientist read this paper. It's really interesting. But it's not just about science. Arguably, the Beatles put together conventionally understood genres of music in unconventional ways, and that yielded what Rolling Stone called the best album of all time. And if you haven't seen the PBS special on the 50th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper, I recommend that highly. So whenever you put, I shouldn't say whenever, but a characteristic of things that change the world is you're putting things together that haven't been put together before in ways that people can wrap their heads around. A third reason is that it's a design problem. The educational system's key user interface up until earlier this month looked like this. And that's showing 1916 classroom merged seamlessly with a 2016 classroom. And the David Orr refers to this as architecture as crystallized pedagogy. And I think that's a good label. It's actually a lot older than a century. That's a Sumerian classroom from 2000 BCE, so 4,000 years ago. And it's not just about the architecture of the building. We also tend to do things like rewrite standards and think that we've changed the operating system when really what we've done is rewritten the user manual. And rewriting the user manual is helpful for certain things, but if you don't change the structure of the system, you're not likely to change the outcomes of the system. And I think we mistake the user manual for the operating system, and those aren't the same things at all. And on top of that, this is not a very user-friendly interface. And that's a couple of pages from the next generation science standards, which are the newish national science education standards. So there's that Sumerian classroom. And I think it's worth considering if a 4,000-year-old design has the educational power that we would like. And suddenly we have scrapped that system, at least for the time being, or shelved it anyway. And it's not just about the architecture of buildings, it's about the architecture of the day, the season, and the year, and on scales actually from minutes to decades. The schedule of schooling is largely unchanged in the last century and longer. My great grandmother would have recognized almost all of the things in my high school daughter's schedule as something that could have been in her schedule, except for the introduction to computers. And another piece of the problem is that real problems in the real world that matter to you and I are hugely interdisciplinary. Climate change, energy, water, soil, physical and mental health care, and we're seeing this abundantly clearly right now with responding to COVID-19, transportation and equality, war and peace, agriculture and our food system, and human migration are all highly interdisciplinary in nature and can only be deeply understood from a systems perspective, and schools suck at that. It is just not the nature of how they were designed or how they came to be. And I think we will do better if we think about how to take advantage of this educational moment to think about interdisciplinary opportunities. And I'll say more about that in a bit. The fundamental structure of schooling is completely uninformed by research on how people learn. And I'll note that there are a bunch of people in this session who have seen the next 75 seconds or so, but it bears repeating. So I'm going to ask you to stop and block out of your mind everything you know about school, but remember how you've learned deeply important ideas. And I'll also note that schools are not broken. They just do something fundamentally different from what we pretend they do. And I think it's worth considering the idea that if it ain't broke, ask if a mechanistic metaphor is really helpful. And I'll take a sip of my beer. And I've asked you to block out of your mind everything you know about school. And of course, I know that's asking you to not think about an elephant. But I really want you to do your best and forget what you know about school, but remember what you know about how you've come to learn important things, and imagine that someone suggests, hey, I've got a great idea. Let's put 1,000 teenagers in a building, sort them into groups of 20 or 30, have someone talk at them about the Battle of Hastings for 45 minutes, then move down the hall and have someone else talk at them for the exact same amount of time about rocks or whatever. And let's do this over and over and over and over again, day after day after day, year after year after year, for years on end. Isn't that a great idea? Well, no, it just really isn't. There are a lot of reasons we continue to do it, even though it's not a good idea. but it's not. There was no educational equivalent of a Charles Darwin who derived a set of natural laws on education and laid them out on the origin of courses, the next generation science standards, and other standards like the Common Core envision a level of interconnection amongst grade levels and disciplines that is exceedingly rare in the post-one-room schoolhouse era. However, that is not saying that schools utterly failed to teach. Most people learned how to read, write, and do basic mathematics in school, but most people don't have useful understandings of what they were taught in school. It's important to note, of course, that if you're reading this, you're probably different from most people. Only about 30% of American adults have a bachelor's degree or higher. And that's referring to a cognitive bias called the availability heuristic. We tend to draw on what's immediately familiar to us, even though we are not generally representative of the population in whatever way we're thinking about. That many teachers are successful in spite of the architecture of classrooms and building, the structure of the school day and the year, and the common ratios of educators to students is a testament to their skills and passion. Imagine if schools were actually designed for learning. How successful could we be? But right now, 90% of your students forget 90% of the content of your course within 90 days of finishing the course. And that's a quote from Don Weinshank, who I worked with when I was in grad school at Michigan State. Now, I've not said much about ecosystems at this point, so that's where we're going next. When there's a change in the environment, ecosystems can respond in 5 qualitatively different ways. And what I'm going to say about ecosystems applies to complex systems in general. The system can continue to operate as before, even though its operations may be initially and temporarily unsettled. So that's descriptive of most reform efforts. The system can operate at a different level using the same structures it originally had, for example, a reduction or increase in species numbers. Some new structures can emerge in the system that replace or augment existing structures, for example, new species or paths in the food web. A new ecosystem made of quite different structures can emerge. And the final and very rare possibility is that ecosystems can collapse completely and no regeneration occurs. And there's the citation for that. The fundamental qualities of these different kinds of changes apply to a range of complex systems, including the system of schooling. We have had a huge disruption to the system of schooling. And again, I'm going to say this a few times through the course of the evening. We want to plant the seed for thinking about how we can change the educational system in good ways that'll be durable beyond the current crisis. We want to take advantage of this catastrophe and not diminish its catastrophic qualities or pretend that this is some kind of thing that will make it all better or anything like that, but recognize that we can take advantage of the disruption to the system if we're thoughtful about it. The next bit is not as polished in its presentation, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some ecosystems concepts that are relevant to the current situation. A paired set of ideas are initial conditions and first cover, and initial conditions are what the system is like from some determined starting point, and first cover is when there is a massive disturbance, like in an ecosystem, a forest fire or a flood. It can essentially reset the initial conditions, and I think the current educational moment is much like that. The existing initial conditions of the educational system include the 50-minute or so class period that meets 3 times a week at the college level or 5 times a week at the high school level, the agrarian calendar that informs K-16 schooling, the age-graded school, meaning putting all 8-year-olds and all 16-year-olds together in groups of 8-year-olds or 16-year-olds, the placing of seats in rows, the expected passive behavior of students, and it up until 2 weeks ago, these practices were so widely spread across the field of education that uprooting them seemed almost unimaginable. And then suddenly we did. What that means for what's next, I'm not quite sure, but some things to think about. Here's a pair of tightly controlled ecosystems that assume a monoculture, some rows of corn, and a lecture hall. In those, looking at comparisons of those things, students are planted in rows, all receiving identical treatment like seeds on an industrial farm. The farmer tries to provide equal amounts of water, fertilizer, and pesticides to each seed in the plot, and the professor does something pretty similar for each student in the room. And those who don't blossom as a result of or in spite of the treatment are weeded out. And we don't really deal with diversity very well in either setting, either biodiversity or which can include things like left-handedness. And I'm not going to go into this, but point out that succession is cyclical in ecosystems and in educational systems. And this is a slightly modified look at an ecosystems model of succession. And I'm going to just kind of go on by that and say that these days we will remember for the rest of our lives, and we want to get them right. And now I do want to open it up for discussion via the chat, I think, and maybe ask Rob to chime in if he's been looking at that, but I'll pull it up and see what I can see. If there are questions, comments, smart remarks, and thinking about what we want to do while we have the chance. It is very, very unclear how long this is going to last. I'm going to stop screen sharing and pull you all up. And since there aren't a ton of questions or comments popping into the chat, you can go ahead and speak. So Ralph, how you doing? So you've got to unmute yourself. I think you can do that. I will. Oh, there you go.
Thanks for the presentation.
Sure.
This has been an incredible opportunity to expand our horizons on what we do. I'm in my final year of a 36-year career, and I would have never, ever developed informational YouTube presentations for my students, nor would I have been utilizing Zoom like you're utilizing to connect with us. And it has, it's been a real shot in the arm for the kids. It's been outstanding as an augmentation to the traditional classroom format. I am an extreme traditionalist. I believe that my 36-year career, I still own and operate an overhead projector.
Excellent.
Which I think I use quite effectively. And the students, in fact, it was funny, many that have viewed my YouTubes this week have commented on what they've remembered from the past. I think it's not so much what we teach, but it is most definitely how we go about teaching it. Yeah. And you made some excellent points in your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a quote that that I haven't thought of in a while that I think comes from Amnesty International matter, maybe. But what you teach is how you teach is what you teach, and I think that's there is some truth in that. Other questions, comments?
Godfrey here.
Hi, Godfrey.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Great. Excited that you started this session.
Yeah, and I'll note that Godfrey was part of the inspiration for this. He and I were tweeting at one another on last Saturday, and from that discussion emerged the idea of science in the virtual pub. So Godfrey, do you want to introduce yourself before your comment or question?
Yeah, hi, this is Godfrey Rangasamy. I'm a pre-K through 12 science supervisor in a large county in Maryland. I as you may be aware, Maryland shut down all schools for the next 4 weeks until April 24th. So as of today, we have our marching orders. So we're struggling with not necessarily teaching through distance learning environment, but to address several things. One, the have and the have-nots for teachers who may not have portals or subscriptions to things like Zoom, not necessarily, Zoom is free. Google Classroom, how to engage their kids, blah, blah, blah. Secondly, we have a very diverse, like most folks across the country, student population, have and have-nots again in terms of digital divide. How do we address
That's a huge
digital environment supporting kids and their parents through this portal? It's huge. I mean, we're talking digital. How do we get print to them? What are some systems? You talk about systems.
Yeah.
Systems and system models are my big cross-cutting concepts.
Yes. Yep.
So how do we address and flatten the world with all these gaps?
That is a great question and a complex one. And another point that I like to make is that we as educators and politicians and journalists are guilty of this as well. Want to simplify the seemingly complex, and that's worth doing a lot of the time. But the world is a wickedly complex place, and we need to complexify the seemingly simple an awful lot of the time to help people understand the complex nature of the problems we're facing. And the coronavirus is unmasking, I think, a lot of these complex problems of digital divide and magnifying, I'm afraid, the digital divide. There was an article in the New York Times today or yesterday that admittedly I only skimmed, but dealing with these questions of the digital divide for the huge number of homeless kids in the New York City schools. I mean, if they don't have a home, they don't have internet access either, of course, and we do need to figure out how to deal with that. Part of the response to that question is that a longstanding problem is that schools did not create, by and large, society's problems, but they're always asked to fix them. We really need coordinated efforts across the range of institutions within a place like, well, anywhere, but like New York City, to provide the kids the services they need so that we don't have, the huge digital divide is a symptom of the economic divide. And unless and until we deal with the economic divide, we can't expect schools to be able to fix that.
Don, there are several comments in the chats about this topic that you might want to take a look at between, especially Anna and Aaron, although there are some others comments as well that on other things.
Yeah, and we've been, the problem of rural internet has been a topic of much discussion in our workplace, because some of our some of our staff who are now no longer going into the office every day are pretty rural and have crappy internet, and that's making it very challenging for them to do their work as telecommuters. So let's see. Yeah, and Sarah's point about needing to figure out how to create the time to do this thinking. We are really flying by the seat of our pants to figure out how to deal with this, and I do think that a pause button is valuable, and not rushing into piling tons of work on to our students when we haven't figured out what we're doing yet. And I am glad to see that in most places anyway, that's not happening. And my older daughter is a freshman in college, and last week was her scheduled spring break, and they extended it by a week to give staff and faculty and staff some time to figure out what they're doing. I don't know if a week was enough. And for my my younger daughter, who's a sophomore in high school, they only gave the teachers a day to figure out. They had a meeting a week ago, Monday, with the staff reporting, and then students were to start doing virtual work on Wednesday. I don't think that was enough time. I don't know how that compares to other K-12 schools, but
Can I step in really quickly?
you betcha.
I'm a director of curriculum for a school in New York State, and one of the reasons that I brought this up was we spent our first week trying to figure out how to feed kids and trying to figure out how to keep kids safe.
Yep.
And keep them warm and make sure they have electricity. So like, let's back up even from the internet.
Yeah.
And at the same time, New York State decided that we needed to put a plan in place. And we had to like go to the New York State portal and put our plan in. And there were all these check boxes. And we're just honestly scrambling because we just got told that people are foiling our plans to find out what we're doing to kind of catch us.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't say anything about
Is that
absolutely
people
following
at the state
plan.
level doing that?
Yeah, the state collected plans. I mean, this isn't something we told our teachers. Like, we're trying to like protect them to give them time to think.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also scrambling to try, like, how do we create time for people, especially when we have a lot of folks that are not safe, that are anxious, that are not being fed, both kids and adults. So I feel like, I don't know, I'm probably sounding super overwhelmed because I've worked longer days the last 2 weeks than ever in my entire career.
Yeah.
And so we really want to take care of kids. And I also, obviously I'm on this, so I really want to shift education. But I also feel like we need to just stop for a couple of months and try and get our acts together. Do the
Great point. Can I chime in on your topic?
Mm-hmm.
So I have a sister that teaches second grade in the Bronx, New York. So what she and I communicated was that all of last week, they were supposed to, which they did, face-to-face training on Google Classroom. She's a second grade teacher. My question to her was, why now? New York State public education, they're supposed to be ahead of the curve. Why are we training teachers last minute in Google Classroom when that opportunity was available across the country for decades? So she said she'll let them know that, Maryland is ahead of the curve, but you're correct. We got to think about the family dynamics, especially our diverse kids. First-time ESOL kids, first-time ESOL families. In the South Bronx, as you know, it's like heavily diverse with those populations. And, forget about Bloom's, talk about Maslow.
Yeah, right.
So those are some pieces, game changers that we got to rethink.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, thinking about the technology piece, we've been offering trainings for years, and we've had a lot of teachers say, I'm not using this. I am going to put stuff up in front of the room on my smart board, my Elmo, my whatever. Like, I'm not going to engage in this. And suddenly they need to, or at least we're thinking that's the way to do this. But we have a lot of kids who we haven't taught to do technology for any sort of educational purposes. And so I think that piece is really tricky. And on top of that, we've had almost a third of our families have somebody lose employment in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah. So, we need to fix society while we're fixing schools. Piece of cake.
So there are lots and lots of comments, and I've been trying to figure out how to organize them in some way. Great questions and interesting things. I don't know if we can get through all of them, but I wondered if we might go back to, so there, it seems to me that there are, at least sort of broadly speaking, two threads going here. One is about just these logistical realities of meeting the needs of families and kids that we've been talking about, and strength of internet and or presence of that. And then there are these other big questions about changing the educational system. So Don, here are just a few comments that were kind of, and I'm sure not all of them along these lines, but that are sort of related. Phil writes, Don, researchers have lobbied for education reform for decades, but the system has resisted. What about this opportunity is different from the past? Melissa says, my science department team at my school chatted today about how we're doing, and then we talked about going forward. We all decided that we couldn't go back to traditional means of teaching, but we didn't want kids sitting in each of our classes on a digital platform 100% of the time either. We're trying to envision a third way while we have the current architecture of schooling. And finally, Ankur says, hey everyone, I was a teaching associate for a class on air and water pollution problems. My question is, what would an alternative education structure look like which makes teaching more effective in terms of translating knowledge into action and embracing self-learning? I'm aware of schools such as Waldorf and Green schools in Bali, which have a more holistic curriculum.
Well, lots of thoughts there. And the first one is, is Phil's, the first one that I think I can handle answering is Phil's question about what's different this time, is that we don't have a choice. That, reform has been hampered by a lot of things, cognitive biases, the status quo bias, which makes us want to keep on doing what we've always done, and I think this is pushing us to a quote from Michael Fullen is that we need to move from doing what we know how to do to doing what needs to be done, and we have been forced to set the current structures of schooling aside. So unlike up until 2 weeks ago, we don't have a choice but to reform. Before we could reform, this is Daphne, by the way, we could reform or not. But now we just have to figure out how to do something fundamentally different from what we've been doing for literally 4,000 years. And I'll also note, Phil was scheduled to be our Science in the Pub speaker. Was that to be last night, Phil?
I believe it was Wednesday, the 25th.
Yeah. So Phil, I understand. I haven't talked to Phil myself, but I've talked to people who've talked to Phil, and Phil, I understand, is game to do the next Science in the Virtual Pub. Do you want to? We'll take a little aside here and let Phil do a little plug for his upcoming talk, which we haven't scheduled yet, but probably
In progress.
sometime soon. So Phil, go ahead and make a plug for the next Science in the Virtual Pub.
Thanks, Don. Well, first I got to say thanks for doing this talk tonight. It's really neat to see how many folks were participating, and it's encouraging, that those of us who are in education are concerned about, continuing our learning and everything. So thank you.
Yeah.
So Ken Zidell from DEC invited me to talk about a topic which I find pretty interesting. And if you're familiar with the story of Mary Anning, then this will be my presentation. It's a little bit of the history of paleontology, a little bit of history of science, evolution, and really sort of a story about what it's like to be sort of an amateur scientist in a society where there's not much mobility. and how you can still make really wonderful discoveries and then get credit for them long after you're dead.
And so that's Phil Stokes, who's the director of the Penn-Dixie Fossil Park in Hamburg, New York, just south of Buffalo. And now back to our regular programming.
Thanks, Don.
Yes, but we'll again, there is a sign-up sheet for expressing interest in Science in the Virtual Pub, linked from the information sheet for tonight, the Google Doc. So look for that, and maybe somebody can paste that into the chat, and we'll send you an email when we get Phil's talk scheduled. And I think we will go at least once a month, and I'm sort of thinking at maybe every 2 weeks, because it's really pretty easy logistically to make these things happen. And I sense that people can use the connection. And of course, the group tonight, I think, is mostly educators, but these are open to anyone who's interested. So having said all that, and going down that garden path a little bit, I've forgotten, of course, the other threads that Rob so nicely summarized a minute ago.
So one of them is Melissa, who says they're trying to, that they don't want to go back to the way things were, but on the other hand, don't want it to be a 100% digital platform, and they're looking basically for a third way.
Yeah,
and sort of within the current architecture, how do you create something that's blended and different? And and Anker, I think, is sort of along those lines. They're looking for other models like Waldorf and green schools.
Yeah, and I think there are lots of ways I think Rob said in a conversation that this is kind of the Cambrian explosion of educational possibilities. And there are an infinite number of ways we can go. And going back to what we were doing before, I think is putting the genie back in the bottle, or whatever metaphor there. That's probably just not going to work to go back to as it was. Things that we've been working on at PRI for 15 years or more is virtual fieldwork experiences, which Melissa knows something about because she was one of our first folks in that group, as was Sarah. That is, some people see virtual fieldwork experiences as a replacement for actual fieldwork, but I don't think there are very many people who actually see it that way. And we certainly don't. We see it as a catalyst for actual fieldwork. And so virtual fieldwork experiences are multimedia representations of actual field sites that students can explore in some meaningful way that we hope has some analog to actually being out in the world. More importantly than how they help you study the place that's actually the focus of the virtual fieldwork experience, I think, is that they provide a model for things that you, teachers and students, might create either together or the students creating them themselves. And this flips the problem of technology keeping kids inside on its head by using technology to go out and capture aspects of the natural world, or man-made world, or whatever, in a way that they can share with others and teach others. So I think that kind of idea has potential to be really useful in what we do next. I also think—
Can I chime in?
Yeah, let me say just one other thing. I also think that as we're doing that, we need to think about the interdisciplinary nature of real world problems in a way that schools have been historically kind of unable to cope with, and figure out how we can break those the ivory towers, the disciplinary silos that separate the scientists from the humanists and so forth. So go ahead, Godfrey.
Yeah, so for the sake of the group, we meaning the county I'm in, Prince George's County Public Schools in Maryland, we have collaborated with PRI. Actually, I've engaged them at a conference, and NSTA conference, I can't recall, maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
I think it was 2 years, maybe it was 3 years ago.
And I saw the opportunity. I'm a pragmatist, and I look for opportunities in terms of that whole nature of the earlier presentation from Don about make those connections interdisciplinary, irrespective of whatever content. So I saw that opportunity and I said, you know what? I'm going to engage these guys. So for the last 2 years, we have engaged PRI to offer some professional learning opportunities for our teachers in terms of a course we have developed to support this a state assessment, a high school state assessment. And the course I developed was biogeochemical systems. And folks thought I was crazy, but craziness go hand in hand with innovation in science. That's my line. So that being said, it's been working out. Furthermore, we have incorporated another connection, understanding global change, with Berkeley professor Jessica Bean. And we're looking at those same interdisciplinary connections to flatten the world through life sciences or biogeochemical and even chemistry course. What does the world look like through these lenses? And we're talking about changing the status quo. The current publisher's textbook does not paint that picture of a real work and work connection. So like with the pandemic, for example, the COVID-19, we were tasked to do several packets for the kids, both digital and hard copies. I personally did one in chemistry. And if you look at the chemistry one, it reads like a current affair type of what's happening. So I mentioned the flattening the curve and, you know, justify the claim and problem solving, and, you know, testing and mole chemistry and stoichiometry with respect to, you know, precision and that sort of stuff. So I think rethinking the whole paradigm of how we connect to different contents in an interdisciplinary platform would be something of the future.
Yeah, and I'm going to put the Understanding Global Change link into the chat if I can find it.
I would like to make a comment if it's possible.
Sure. Hi, Glenn.
I'm Glenn. I'm from the University of Calgary. I was a New York State earth science teacher for several years and a geologist even before then, and currently hold a position in the geology department at the University of Calgary, but doing geoscience education research. And I think as much as I would be optimistic about this idea that we've got a disruption in the system and therefore we should take advantage of the ability to change, I think the system is so dependent on future employment, let's say, that it would be a very difficult thing. The idea that we have to continue on with business as usual, even though it's virtual, instead of just ending things and saying, we got the notification on Wednesday, maybe we should start making, this is Wednesday ago, so a week and a half ago, or 2 weeks ago. We should start thinking about a contingency plan in case classes go remote. And then on that Friday, we were told Monday we're going remote. And then we were told on Sunday that because Alberta's public schools were also closing, that professors might be having childcare issues. And so we won't go live on Monday, we'll go live on Tuesday.
There we go.
So, because everyone will be able to figure out their childcare situation, because all daycares were closed also.
Right.
But the constant news to us was that your health, the health of our faculty and staff are the priority. But to me, it seems like the health of the faculty and staff was a inconvenience, something to be worked around because we wanted business to continue as usual. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And with that understanding, and we have connected education to future employment, right? This is what we do in order to have a job, in order to be productive citizens, rather than this is what we do to just be better citizens, you know, regardless of whether we're productive or not. And so I think we're so tied into the system of capitalism, of an outcome, a bottom line, that we cannot afford to disrupt it, you know. And even if this is a 2-month or 3-month, like, okay, let's just stop education for 3 months. Like, are people going to be that much worse off at the end of 3 months? But yet we are trying as hard as we can to work, and until we separate education from work, which again, the structure of school, right, is the assembly line. It builds workers. I mean, that's kind of the purpose. Until we get rid of that paradigm, you know, I'm not very hopeful that we will ever change the structure.
Well, yeah, I am wondering if one of the outcomes of this whole thing, not just the educational implications, but a bunch of stuff is not going to get done for the next X number of months. And I wonder if people will go, oh, that didn't really need to get done. And
Right.
maybe we can slow down the some of the craziness and recognize that we can afford to not do certain things, and it won't be the end of the world. At the same time, that's true. I don't remember if it's Canada or Ontario that's going to, you know, the U.S. is talking about a $1,200 one-time payment for offsetting the economic impacts of this, and I think either Ontario or Canada is talking about $2,000 a month for the duration, and that's a little different than what we're doing here.
Yeah, I think someone that was on a meme, and I think that is incorrect, though.
Okay.
Canada is doing quite a bit more, and I looked up just to see what it was, and there is money per month depending on your income, and it increases per child as well. And Canada currently has a child benefit anyways up to 18 if you qualify, and as a university professor, I qualify. Like, I get money from the government monthly for my two kids. So I'm not sure if it's $2,000 a month, and it's probably a sliding scale depending on, you know, family size and stuff like that. But yeah, it's certainly a different world from the United States.
Yeah, but in any case, I think I am curious to see if we'll figure out that there are things that we don't need to do, and if we can pick that up in a way that's humane to stop doing some of the things that we're spending energy and resources and stress on now, and hopefully end up with something more equitable. That is probably wishful thinking. I will.
Done. Oh, I'm sorry. You go ahead.
Hi, I'm Gina. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
So first off, I just want to say thank you. This has been really great and a lot of great comments, and I'm going to sort of cycle back to a couple of topics if I can. I'll say first, though, that I teach in Vermont at a community college, and I teach high school all the way up to, you know, sometimes I have seniors. and I've been teaching online for about 5 years. So the first thing that I found interesting about all of this is everybody's moving to online, and yet nobody seems to be looking for expertise on how to teach online. And having spent, having moved from face-to-face to mostly online, I know I've spent years developing how do I do this and what else can I do with it, and sort of thinking about how to make it really robust. So I find this interesting vacuum, that's not happening. That's one thing. And then the next thing that I wanted to share, I absolutely agree with, I came into this a little bit late, but right at the point where you said, our educational system is sort of all wrong. It doesn't do what we want it to do. I'm a historian by training, but I do teach environmental history and do history of science and climate stuff. So that's kind of why I'm here. But I was teaching a world history course face-to-face a couple of years ago, and I decided to do something really different. I had it in the computer lab. We still had discussion, but I wanted to really teach my students the habits of being a historian, and I really premised the whole thing on inquiry. And what I found was they were not at all able to deal with this, not even with guidance. And I will say that, it's a community college course, and I had a bunch of high school kids in there, and they weren't all ready for college, but it was not an advanced course. So some of the issue that we're going to have to deal with, part of what I'm saying, is that we have a culture that doesn't know how to do this, and students who don't know how to do this.
Yeah, and that goes partly to Kelly's question about students being so attached to grade, and I would add many teachers being so attached to grades. And for most people, after they're done with schooling, there's really not much of an analog to grading in things that most people do, most adults do for most of their days. Really doesn't have anything that looks all that much like a grade. And figuring out how to move away from that, I think is an important issue to consider. I also know that some schools right now are saying don't grade anything.
Yeah,
which I think
I wanted to comment on that.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Go ahead, Anna.
So yeah, my school has said that, like, just kind of grade for effort, but like you can't really give a quiz now, they'll all cheat. So then we're talking about, okay, the quizzes, like I'm going to make quizzes that they can redo again and again until they have a grade they like. So I think that is going to be a disruption, is the grading in a good way.
Yep.
I do, the thing is though, I mean, I'm going to try to be as innovative as possible, but I still feel like I need to be a little subversive, because my school today said the kids are getting overwhelmed. I mean, I think it is what Gina was saying. We really have, and guilty as charged, because you give in, spoon-fed these kids. So, I mean, they can't handle the in-depth. So we were told today, like every day, post the assignment by 9 a.m. So you have to really chunk it for them. And you can only Zoom during your class. So the schedule is still there, because it was getting overwhelming for them, to not have a schedule. So unfortunately, I think the system structurally is now coming into this online situation. But, I mean, there's still a lot of freedom. I'm like, if I can't do it now, I'll never be able to do it. I have no discipline problems.
Yeah, right.
I have no interruptions.
Yeah, they can't throw a spitball, can they?
No, I know, right? It's like, yeah. So I think it is, the possibilities are wonderful, although we do need to take care of ourselves, because this can get overwhelming.
Yeah.
Because you're excited about the possibilities. And on that note, I'm going to say goodnight to everyone. It's past my bedtime.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you for doing this, though.
Yep.
Anna, before
Okay,
you.
good night, everyone.
I think
Anna.
Kelly wants to respond and
Oh.
somebody else too. So.
Okay.
Well, no, it's okay. And if you have to go, Anna.
No, that's fine. Oh, hi, Kelly.
But I think Gina, hi, Gina wanted to say something to you specifically.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would encourage you to, you said, oh, they cheat online. Just rethink what you're using your quizzes for.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, like, so for instance, my final exam.
I think that was the message from administrators or.
Oh, I thought you were saying that you were having an issue.
Yeah.
No, well, I know if I did a traditional quiz, like a Google quiz that I do in class, it's going to be different, right? Like, they're at home. So I just had to think of it differently. And I think the whole grading, the way we were doing grading, is gone. It's gone. It cannot happen that way anymore. And that's a good thing. So any kid who is grade motivated might not be doing much for a while, but then hopefully it'll change. Hi, Kelly.
That's where my question came in is, looking forward and not just in this time specifically, but the hopes that we go back to school someday. Like, how do we, I had a conversation not even a week before we left for this crisis here. And I had a conversation with a kid because I was doing a very inquiry-based activity. We had just started the unit. And I threw it out at them. I hadn't taught him a thing about the earth, moon, and sun yet. And I heard him say to his friend, and he said it on purpose so I could hear him. And he goes, how do I even know this? Like, I don't know. She didn't tell us anything about this. And I went over and I go, you're figuring it out. That's how I teach you. I mean, it's almost March, or it is March now. You know how I teach you. Like, you're figuring it out, and that's how you're learning it. And I go, why do you need to, he goes, I just need to know what's on the test. And I was like, the test isn't for like 4 weeks. Do you really want to know what's on the test today? Like, what are we going to do for the next 4 weeks after that? And he was like, yeah, that's all I want. And I go, well, that's it. You're not taking the test. You're not allowed to take the unit test, is what I told him. And so I've been thinking about him this whole time. I have not gotten much engagement from him since we left school, because that happened. And it was kind of a cool, there's more to the story. Like, there was a really good response from him actually after that, but we only had about 2 days before we left, and now I've lost him. So I really was looking forward to that developing and seeing what happened on the day of the test. When he sat down, he probably assumed I was going to give it to him anyway, but I would have said, no, you're not allowed to take it. I don't know what I would have done that day. We were kind of deciding, my co-teacher and I were trying to decide what to do on that day, but I want to know how we get kids to detach from those grades, because it's not just about right now. We're not grading anything. We're not allowed to grade anything right now, but that's the struggle. I have a less than a third of my students that are engaging on a regular basis because there's no grades. And so I've been having conversations with them every time I get to see them, the ones that do show up, and those are the ones I shouldn't necessarily be having that conversation with, about learning for the sake of learning. Learning is the reward of learning, and how your brain is like a muscle, and you have to practice some critical thinking things. Like, it's great to be, one of them's building a shack, or not a shack, a shed in the back of their yard. One of them's been helping with all the yard work, and one of them's been helping with an elderly neighbor, and that's all good stuff. But we have to keep their brains active for critical thought and other academic thoughts as well, not just the hard labor part, even though that's also great.
Right.
And I understand the mental health issue too, like the mental health, the things, I mean, we start every Zoom meeting with like chatting about how they're feeling. I send out polls, and the first question is, how are you? And, with emojis for answers, and trying to, I'm not that kind of teacher usually, but I've been really emphasizing that while we've been gone, especially because there's no grade attached. So now we have the freedom. I don't have a exam at the end of this year. I mean, well, I don't know that. We don't know that. I didn't say that.
Right. Yeah, but I think you're right. I would be shocked if we had. And I do want to pick up on at least part of Glenn's comment there, which is changing the subject a little bit. And that's, we have been doing this stuff for 4,000 years. And, one response to that is, well, maybe we're doing it. We've been doing it for 4,000 years because it works. But I think that you can say that about any ancient technology up until we stop using it. So I'm going to read you a little snippet from a manuscript that I had been working on and need to get back to. So up until we stopped depending on any ancient technology, the same argument could have been made for any of those technologies. Some version of wood burning hearth heated our homes and cooked our meals until it didn't anymore. Using handwritten letters to communicate across distance was fundamental to communication until it wasn't anymore. We used our own feet and animal power as the primary ways to move from place to place until we didn't anymore. Likewise, we'll use the course, the lecture, the exam, the classroom until we don't anymore. This paper asserts that it is the stasis of these structures that is the most important rate limiting factor in educational reform. If what students are doing in reform vision looks like figure 1, which is the figure in the advertisement, do not expect substantial improvements in outcomes. So yeah, we've been doing it for 4,000 years, which is true of everything until we stop doing it.
Yeah, I mean, my point is, I think, so I study language also.
Indeed.
And yeah, right. And if you listen to the way we talk about teaching, you'll see that we have a very clever way of describing things like, we'll deliver a lecture, take notes. Do you guys get it? Her brain soaks it up. Keep an open mind. He wasn't very receptive. All of these metaphors that we use are for education and teaching and learning are transfer of knowledge metaphors. Because when we are a student in a class and we sit and listen to an instructor and we learn something, we're not aware of the cognition that is going on. We're not aware of our brain actually creating the knowledge, right? Like, I'm not getting anything from the instructor except for alternating expansions and contractions of air. That's it, right? I'm not getting knowledge from a professor. What I'm getting are vibrations in the air, and those vibrations trigger my eardrum and the hammer and the anvil and the stirrup, and it turns that into electrical impulses that go to my brain, and my brain does all of the work of interpreting what it is that you said and then giving meaning to it. But we don't experience it as that. And so the idea that what we experience is, I get knowledge from you, and therefore the most efficient way to have that happen is for you to stand up in front and give me the knowledge, and to just sit there very passively. And until we break away from that, which would be very difficult because we will have to become aware of our own meaning making. That's another obstacle, I think.
Yeah, again, that's a very, very heavy lift.
Connection to
and I see
very concrete experiences of receiving knowledge, even though that's not really what we do.
That's right.
And that was my point.
Yeah, it's a good
one. So I see we're losing some of our participants because we're
because I'm talking too much.
It's all you, Glenn.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I wanted to say is that a couple people earlier in the chat wrote. Sarah Miller said, "Is there a hashtag to keep the conversation going?" Aaron says, "Every 2 weeks sounds great." Point is that we have so much more to say and talk about than we can do in this one session. And Don, do you have any preconceived ideas of how we might keep this going?
I really don't. Other than I've got a list of emails of people who have filled out the form. Anyway, I have a list of emails. And I can send off a note to all the people that filled out the form and say, here's the email list of people who were involved. And we can have another session in this vein, as well as Phil's session in a different vein, and continue the conversation that way. I'd be delighted to carry on conversations like this, and I think having a beer along with it is a nice touch. Do other people have thoughts on how to carry the conversation forward?
Well, one thing that strikes me is that there are multiple concerns, threads here, each one of which could be a separate discussion. And we've kind of bounced around, which I think is appropriate this evening. But if we did more of these, maybe it would be useful to dedicate a particular discussion to, one of the digital divide, or, best practices in online learning, or, and maybe that's something where we could ask, once you send out the list, we could either make a list and say, what would you like, or just ask people for ideas, what they would like.
And, I think there's a space in the form where you can put in comments if you want to volunteer to help carry on that conversation in some way. I would be delighted, because my bandwidth, like a lot of people right now, is limited. So
it strikes me there's a lot of expertise on this call, some of whom could speak and have this evening, very knowledgeably about certain parts of this, and so that would be nice to have somebody volunteer to.
I would love to volunteer.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think we can continue the conversation in another session, maybe off the top of my head, maybe 2 weeks from tonight. We can say, let's have round 2 of this particular conversation, and maybe have Phil's talk either 4 weeks from tonight, or figure out a different time, if that makes sense. Does that sound reasonable? Let me look at my calendar. I'm pretty sure everything out in the world has been canceled, so I'm pretty sure my Thursday night 2 weeks from tonight is free. So that'd be Thursday, April 9th. And it is free in my calendar. I'm just putting it in my calendar so that I do it. And I will also put it in the document for the announcements. And I should also point out that there is a donation link at the end of that document to donate to PRI. So I'm just typing this into the document at the bottom. All right. So the crowd is shrinking. I'm game to get another beer if people want to hang out for a while. Also game to let it end. Thank you, Caitlin.
I drank my beer and I'm going to take off, but it was nice to see and hear everybody.
And Ken has drank a beer, so I'm going to take a walk with my computer and to the kitchen and grab another beer.
I'm talking to everybody. I'll be out too.
All right. Thanks, Godfrey. Glad you could join us.
Fun.
It was a pleasure chatting with everyone. I will finish my beer and go have some dinner. I'm 2 hours earlier than you guys.
Yes.
Hey, Don, can I add something in?
Absolutely.
To the discussion?
Yep.
Hey, everyone, Christina. I'm an educator, but at the undergraduate level. And I don't think this is necessarily a topic that we want to dive into tonight, but maybe something that we can think about if we're going to have future conversations like this. I know that something that I've been, and I know my colleagues have been struggling with, is like everything that we talked about tonight is super relevant, navigating how to help our students through this and what this means for the education and the long-term consequences are, or what this means for the education system and what the long-term consequences are But the other reality is that right now, we have courses to finish, and our students at the undergraduate level, especially those who are going on to graduate school and are taking upper level classes for their major, we have to very immediately find a way to switch our curriculum for a class that wasn't designed to be online to be online. And so having some sort of a discussion, especially people who've taught a lot of online classes before, around like, what are those best practices? How do we kind of replicate, hands-on lab stuff? How do we get these discussions where we want our students to be able to read and discuss current literature or things like that? And then on top of that, how do we do it in a situation where a lot of our students are living at home, sharing laptops, not having internet access? Is it a synchronous model? Is it an asynchronous model? And just some sort of a conversation around those lines, especially since, I've only been teaching for like 3 years. So I am, much newer to this and would love and benefit from information from those that are wiser from experience. Anyway, so those are my thoughts.
So where and what do you teach, Christina?
Yeah, so I teach at the University of New England in Maine, and I teach behavior major. So I teach freshmen all the way up through seniors in all kinds of animal behavior related classes.
Good questions all, and I wish I had a magical answer for them, and I don't. The disruption to, I feel especially sorry for seniors in high school and seniors in college right now with how this is disrupting their lives in a way that I think is fairly different from people who aren't about to be done with their particular level of schooling. And I have answers on that. Go ahead, Ken.
I was going to say, the nice thing is everybody in the entire world right now is going through the exact same thing. So it's a level playing field for everybody, unfortunate as it may be.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I do think the grad schools will be tolerant of the difference of people who graduate in 2020 and undergraduate institutions as well for the students coming in next year. And I hope the college board who administers the AP and all of that will also let cool heads prevail on figuring out how to go with the flow on this.
So they canceled all of the SATs, right? SATs, I think they canceled everything.
Yeah, I would assume so, but I hadn't heard that